welcome to Epiphytic Cacti. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about this bloom. This hybrid is supposed to be Mr. P. That's a little sketchy here. So what had happened was this particular plant was in the basement and it had already previously had a very large bud. It was a very good sized bud, and the bud actually aborted just before blooming. And so this bud was actually a much smaller bud. But coming from the basement where it was really even temperatures with no, there's no rain or any elements or anything like that in the basement. There's fans running all the time. It was about 65 degrees on average. Like at nighttime it would get a little bit colder, and then during the day it would get a little bit warmer, but on average about 65. There wasn't much variability in the temperature. And so this bud, it was somewhat of a juvenile size, and from the basement, I brought this outside when I had this partially formed bud. A few things can happen when you do that. It can actually stress it out, and it can cause the bud to abort. All of a sudden it's in a completely different environment. There's different lighting. The humidity is much higher. It's getting rained on. I don't know if you can see here, but this pot is actually wet from it getting rained on. And so the bud is suddenly going through completely different things. So it can just straight up abort. In this case, it did not abort. Instead, what it did was opened way before it should have. So it was underdeveloped, and it stressed it enough to cause the bloom to open. And now what I have is this bloom that is supposed to be Mr. P, but I'm not entirely sure it is Mr. P. And I won't be able to tell that until it blooms again, most likely next year. This plant is really small. Like you can see, it's actually really small. This has never really grown very well for me. And deceivingly, this plant is 2 years old. So this plant has just not really done all that well for me. It's interesting that because the initial bloom that was actually on this plant was on a different one of these cuttings. So there's also, and this is usually kind of a no-no. I would say that this is something that I wouldn't necessarily do unless you are absolutely certain that they are in fact the same hybrid. What happened was I got 2 of these cuttings from one source and then 2 of these cuttings from a different source. And, I thought they looked the same, so I put them together, but it's a real possibility that one of these is not actually correct and one of them is. And it's a real possibility both of them are not correct. I'm not sure. Like I said, now I have to wait until this thing blooms again to decide whether or not, and even worse, I have to wait until half of these bloom and then the other half bloom to be sure that one or the other is actually the correct hybrid. It's a total disaster now. But you can see this flower is definitely kind of weirdly small, just because, like I said, it bloomed prematurely. I would actually say that this bud opened when it was, oh my goodness, probably about half the size of the other one. I also feel like this never really opened fully. And it was kind of a strange thing because you could tell, like I could feel it in the petals even when it opened. I could feel they didn't have the same amount of stiffness that they would otherwise. It was almost like it was already wilting. The colors seem very off for Mr. P, but like I said, it's a first time bloom cutting. It probably doesn't have the greatest amount of energy under a whole lot of stress. Very strange things can happen, so I can't completely write this off yet. There are times I look at it and I'm thinking, perhaps. You can actually even see in the stamen how incredibly short the stamen are because of it opening way too soon. So it's just really, really short. It's just kind of goofy flower. So I just kind of wanted to cover that a little bit, that like sometimes a little bit of stress on a newly forming bud can cause some kind of curious things to happen, as well as the kind of silliness of putting all of these in the same pot, making the assumption that from 2 different sources they were correct, because now you can see I have a little bit of a problem on my hands. So I think it's a little informative in that way to just, word of caution. Hopefully she blooms again next year. Thank you for watching and happy cacti growing.